Lila here with the Catalyst Show, amplifying voices, igniting change. Today, I am honored to have a beautiful, wonderful guest, a remarkable Miss Lila Sophia Tresemer. Lila is the co-founder of the StarHouse in Boulder, Colorado, a sacred space dedicated to weaving wisdom, community, and transformation. She is a group facilitator, certified mediator, author, ceremonialist, and minister with a lifelong dedication to building global community and honoring the feminine in sacred union with the masculine. Her work has taken her across the world, from co-creating Women of Vision in Israel and Palestine to guiding tours in Washington, D.C. that engage with archetype of the feminine. She continues to offer powerful programs in sacred living and remembrance, both online and on-site at the StarHouse. Her current passion is weaving the living network of the lineage of Sophia. How exciting! Connecting men and women across the globe in sacred earth activism and spiritual practice that bring balance and transformation to these times. She's also the author of Don't Go Back to Sleep, The Conscious Wedding Handbook, The Goddess of America, Sacred Activism for Our Nation, and Sophia Gnostic Creation Story. Lila, welcome to the Catalyst Show. Such a great gift to have you here.
Well, thank you, Delilah. I so delight in your presence and am happy you're doing this ongoing podcast. I think it'll serve a lot of people. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's so wonderful to have guests like you that are creating such big change in the world during this time of chaos, and that are also helping others to activate in this. For me, I'll start there. For me, the story began with actually having this deep connection to you, in a sense, with your name. Back, for those that don't know, my childhood name was Lila. and you know, I felt a really deep resonance when I saw your name, first of all, when I met you, and it really brought me back through a journey of connection with myself. And this is how beautiful the universe is working to you know, use other people as well to connect back to our own power and our own self so that we can create change in the world. So I'm deeply thankful for your presence and connecting with you and for you to be here. But you know, I want to know, and I'm pretty sure our listeners want to know a little bit more about your journey, because your path weaves together ceremony, sacred activism, and community in such a beautiful way that, you know, we want to know a little bit more about you. How did that start for you?
I want to, before responding directly to that, just to say that everything you just referenced in terms of, you know, connecting with your name, your power, your vision, and the inspiration of that, to me, that's 90% of the whole journey, right? So thank you for bringing that in, because I feel like that is a segue to the, you know, the larger question is, for me, like, how do we each come from our highest vision, our deepest knowing, our sense of devotion and dharma? Why are we here? Why, in my cosmology, I have a sense that we have a choice about coming or not coming and where incarnation takes us. Not probably 100% across the board, but I do feel like it's more empowering to feel like we're not just here as a random chance, but that actually something in the highest frequency of self chose to be here, chose to come. at this time, to this planet, to this, this cycle of challenge. And let's just assume that that might be true. As my beloved used to say, it's a hypothesis. A lot of spiritual traditions do acknowledge that as a strong possibility. And I feel like when a human being, in this 3D world with a lot of, how would we say it, a lot of our memory kind of short-circuited about where were we before incarnation, that finding our way and finding the source of a kind of universal connection to love and power and vision, not just for self, but for community and for the world, becomes almost an evolutionary imperative at this time. Right? Like, how can we be the highest, the best, the truest, and actually take an active role in contributing to harmony, wholeness, healing for self, for community, for planet? So I think, for me, that's been a reasonably lifelong calling, starting when I was in my early 20s. So that's gone back 50 some years. And really looking at what is possible. What's possible? And in those last 50 years, it's only become more and more imperative that our connection to source and whatever tolerance is necessary for us to co-create from different experiences or expressions of that source, because we're all human beings on this planet and we all share the same resources and the same stars and moon and sun. Like, how can we find the highest common denominator? So that may or may not answer your question, but that's what comes up in this.
It's a beautiful answer. Yeah. Love that. I love how you gave that, example, and coming to a space where it is kind of beyond walls, having this sacred essence beyond the walls of our place, or and really connecting to your whole community, and just having a different perspective of why we're here, so that we can do our job, right? Do what we came here to do and really step into our mission. The StarHouse is such a unique place for someone who hasn't been to the StarHouse. How would you describe the feeling, since we're talking about, the sacred spaces, and why is it so unique?
That's a great question. If you asked, 12 people who either live here or work up here, you'd probably get 12 answers. So this is mine. It's a study in universal principles that is remarkably simple in its execution. So we sometimes marvel because it's about 40 feet in diameter, and it looks and appears to be a circular building. It's actually 12-sided with 12 posts. And each post represents one of the zodiacal, we call them dancers, the zodiacal beings, zodiacal signs of the zodiac. And yet when you do 12 sides, it looks circular. So it's very rounded on the outside, and on the inside, just very subtle angles. It was oriented very, very precisely to Polaris, the North Star. So what that means is that it sits directly in relationship within like a half a degree or something to the true directions of north, south, east, and west. And for anybody who works with any kind of directional template, a medicine wheel or calling in the four directions as part of a ceremonial moment. It's really something to be in a building that has honored that as a tradition, honored the Native American people of the land, the Ute, Arapaho, and Cheyenne, who were the original stewards. So in honoring that, over 36 years since it was opened, it creates a field. So there's two things at play. There's the form and the field. And the humans and human hearts bring to the field and to the form a kind of living amplification of community, of connection, of honoring something greater than our own personal selves. And the goal from its inception, my husband, who passed a year and a half ago, David, was the original visionary with his partner at the time, and a small group of people who got together and designed how it would sit in relationship to the landscape, to those directions. So it was very, very, very intentional. A primary architect was a man named Phil Tabb, and Phil has written some beautiful books and really presented through his career as an architect how to develop structures that what he calls thin spaces, create designs that have a very thin membrane between the physical actuality of a building and the kind of the unseen world, so to speak, and or nature, which is both seen and unseen if one kind of feels into nature spirits and things like that. So he had a great team. David did in 1989 when they started the construction. And the building was opened in 1990, and then closed for a while as transitions in relationship happened. And then David and I met and were married there in 1995. Actually, this would have been our 30th anniversary, September 24th this year. Yeah, so it's a combination of I think, the human, of architectural design, of universal principles. They were very clear that they wanted to work into a beautiful open space, universal principles of that kind of orientation. Also dimension, proportion, there's a lot. We do a whole course on called StarHouse Mysteries that unfold some of the ways that the templates and geometries are captured, in the space and enhanced by human awareness. So I think that's one reason, and also because it feels circular. There are a lot of windows, so the outside is almost as easily accessible as the inside. We have a lot of roaming wildlife, so it's not unusual to have a bear kind of walk by outdoors during a ceremony, or a fox come and sniff at the gate and things like that. And that's always a big delight to city dwellers, and to us as well. And I think the other thing is that it is surrounded by nature. It's also designed to be more of a quiet space. There's not a lot of hum or electromagnetic interference and presence in the field there. And also because it has attracted a community of people who've been dedicated to it. It wouldn't exist without the human beings who have, given their vision and, volunteered time. And we have a very small paid staff and a lot of people who think of this as their spiritual home.
It's beautiful. Yes. It's such a unique spot where it's located. Like you're saying, it's not just building community with the people that come to the events and come to learn and build community in that sense, but also community with nature and with animals that are coming up to the StarHouse. You mentioned David. I feel like that it's such a special time because we're in September. to really highlight his, I know he had this vision of doing this blueprint of StarHouse, but can you talk a little bit more about his blueprint and, in honor of him, if he could say something right now, like what is his message to everybody else, to humanity and the community?
What is his message? I love that. I think that his message would be, about the weaving of earth, stars, and human hearts. David was a Renaissance man, Harvard graduate with a PhD in psychology. This is one of my favorite stories about him. And when he graduated in 1975, he approached his professors as the way was open for him to be a professor and follow the academic trail. He was a very good student, amazing mind, and he asked his professors to help him understand, as now holding a PhD in psychology, who was psyche and who was logos, which makes up the word psychology. And the professors didn't really have a response to a question like that. And there was something, I'm sure it was more involved than this, but in the short version, where he kind of went, wow, if I can't kind of come to grips and understand, basically psyche as the soul and logos as the word or the principle of organized consciousness, then I don't know if I really have a future in academia. So he kind of ended up leaving Harvard and Boston, bought a farm in Vermont, and became an organic farmer because he felt like that was going to give him a lot more direct experience with.
Wow.
Yeah, isn't that gorgeous? With the forces of life and, again, earth, stars, and human hearts. How do we all have to, as farmers, deal with our local star as a sun and the cycle of the seasons and growing in relationship and harmony with that. So he actually then ended up working closely with a beautiful being, Elliot Coleman, who founded sort of the organic movement of agriculture in the United States. And, he and David did some work together, went on tours of European organic farms in the 70s. And so he had this whole other side. One of David's best-selling books to this day is the one on how to use a scythe and, how to farm without machinery and be in right relationship. So interesting early part of his life. He had two beautiful children in Vermont with his wife at the time, Susan. And from there, life took them all in different directions until he ended up coming to Boulder. About 1986, I think, is when he purchased this land up here from another luminary in the Boulder area named Gilbert White. His wife, Ann White. The Ann White Trail is a famous trail in Boulder that actually borders our northern property line. And Gilbert loved David's vision of what he envisioned happening up here and chose him over some other applicants at the time to purchase these lands. So that led to the community creation of the StarHouse and the surrounding areas. So his message, as a kind of Renaissance guy and a lover of the stars, because StarHouse was dedicated early on, as if you look at the floor, it looks like the map when you get your astrology chart done, with 12 equal pie shapes. And we then added 12 standing stones outside. And he really wanted the space to be simple, also like a palette, so that, when you first see it, we keep it very open. The only thing that's a constant is a large sort of 4-foot diameter hanging earth in the center, because we feel like it really is a dedication of we call it a trans-denominational temple, so that any group of people can come here and feel that their work with the sacred can be held, and that we really invite them to dedicate their work to the harmony and healing of the earth. So it's kind of like a 3 octaves of personal development, really handling, healing, ancestral healing, personal healing, physical healing, emotional healing, and then moving from that out to community healing, and how can we go from self-realization to earth realization, so that we start to recognize it really is up to us individually to bring our focus and attention, even though it's a little challenging right now to know how to do that, and to be to have some sense of impact. But that was something that we worked with, David and I, in developing different kinds of programs. And you mentioned sacred activism in the introduction. I feel like, this is a time for each of us to consider what might that mean. That's there's a longer piece to say about that, but there's something about how do we, take a stand without enforcing polarization. I don't really feel like, seeing things in terms of black and white, left and right, is ever going to answer the needs of the time. I feel so strongly, and in a lot of our work together, we would bring in this fabulous Einstein quote that, no problem in consciousness is ever solved at the same level that created it. So if we don't have some capacity to keep expanding beyond the battlegrounds, we're not going to be able to fix anything. I think I'll stop there.
That's important that you said that. It's working at a higher level, so that you can see what's going on, and really not feed into more separation, because that's important, right? Like, we want to make a change on the earth. We want to create some sort of clarity and help the chaos that's going on, but being completely mudded into the chaos is not going to help, correct?
I like that, being mudded in the chaos.
You're stuck there, you're stuck. You can't walk when you're in the mud. So, how can we work? I know you said working at a higher octave, a higher frequency. For people that are not too familiar with activism, how can we stop creating more division, more segregation, more separation? Because saying, I'm part of this group and this is the best group ever because it's being segregated, you're automatically segregating yourself by creating that group, right? Groups that are discriminated, same thing. I'm going to build this group, and only that group, because they're discriminated, now I'm part of that group and I support that group and nobody else. That's also separation. It's also segregation. It's even at a deeper level, actually. So for somebody out there that is really interested and has felt a deep calling to practice sacred activism, as you call it, what is something that they can start doing now?
I think that's in a way the golden question of the hour, and I think it's a question that all of us need to be in an active inquiry with. I would say with our allies, so to speak. Whether that's a spiritual tradition or a sense of a high value. Not everybody identifies with a spiritual or religious tradition. Yeah, so sacred activism to us, and it was a big question for us. It was a word that came through about the same time that Andrew Harvey began using it and made it much more well known. And I'm a deep respecter of Andrew's work and the way that he approaches sacred activism. For us, we're slightly different. Andrew's way is that he takes groups to a lot of different locations on the planet and engages in, prayer and ritual and acknowledgement of those locations. Ours was more focused on this location as an intentionality to create a sacred space that worked with universal principles. So in the course of 30 plus years of being up here, I feel like the space has been a mentor for us. David and I had a lot of alignment around what we personally considered and found and had both been attracted to for many decades as a sacred pattern of what I would call Western esotericism and the design of some of the great cathedrals in Europe, and all followed some of these principles that were laid down by different templates, whether it was Rosicrucian or, the Masons or Templars. I mean, some of those groups were very present, I know, in David's psyche. And for me, it was like, okay, I love all that, and the sacred feminine has got to be woven into those patterns for them to rediscover the heart. And so that's where our partnership got to be very poignant as a really deep honoring and respect of each other and what we brought to sacred union. So our activism became, and is still becoming, something of a laboratory of how do we take what we hold, so deeply, each of us, in our hearts, invite in the intelligence, whatever that might mean to an individual, to work with us as we become more of a vessel. I'm a very firm believer in, free speech and in people finding their ways within heart and compassion. And for some people that's very likely, demonstration and being on the streets and finding their voice. But that for us became not so much that, but working with sacred principle to develop ways of holding prayer that truly, as you're saying, wasn't founded and based in separation, but was actually finding what I would call the highest common denominator. Like, do we care about the planet? Like, the four elements right in there, sacred activism, some people became, advocates for clean water and, clean air and, the rights of the land to be farmed organically or biodynamically. There's, sacred activism can look like anything. It can look like the way in which, we work with our communities or our gardens or our families. For us, it was a way to develop coherence in a group of individuals who were willing to work with principles, and then to build, like a form that could be offered to the good of the whole. So we made it really clear that this wasn't about taking sides, whether that's politically or around the various, horrendous wars that are happening on the planet, but we would address the situation from a place of deep compassion and also working with universal principles. That gets a little more technical because we do work with geometries and, with the Platonic solids and constructions of geometric form, all of which are not in that domain of right and wrong. you start working with sacred geometry, and there are really things to be discovered and felt and experienced with geometries. So that's a little bit about how we develop and learned actually from the structure of the StarHouse itself.
The StarHouse, thank you for that, because it really paints a picture of, the many ways that is not just one route, that there's many ways that people can connect to their own way of contribution and in balance on the earth, and how can we all take care of the earth together. Is there, you mentioned sacred geometry, is there a particular practice or ritual or something that you can share maybe with sacred geometry and nature that people can try at home, that they can try in their own communities?
There's this kind of a yes and to that. We developed, especially over COVID, which was kind of fascinating, that period of time we've all lived through. And in those early days, David and I had just prior to COVID had started to develop some online courses. So there are, hours and hours and hours of response to that question on the courses. One was called Sacred Sites as consciousness tools, with the support for people to create according to templates, right? So templates can be anything from working with the 4 directions or the 12 zodiacal signs, or the elements of earth, air, fire, water, laid out in some way. Templates can look like geometries, like 5-pointed stars or 6-pointed stars, or any of the platonic solids. So we on this landscape, we have a bit of land to work with. StarHouse is on 35 acres, and we've kind of developed 7 particular sites, from a well to a walking labyrinth, a double tetrahedron swing. So they became the places that people can visit and just kind of have experiences there. So in this particular course, we just found a way to support people to create in their backyard simple locations or a dedication, in some way to a place in nature that they could return to, again, based on their guiding and overseeing spiritual nature. It might just be a bowl of water that they keep filled for the wildlife, and an honoring of the essential nature of water for life to exist. Other people found that they wanted to create a setting like that in their office building where lots of therapists were working, and they wanted to have a little, meditation reflection area. So for me personally, those kinds of settings are terrific when they have a natural setting as much as possible. I know our local hospital has set up some beautiful places of reflection, indoor and outdoor. So I think more and more people are getting more familiar with how some of these patterns, even the labyrinth, the Chartres Cathedral labyrinth, has become found more and more in hospital settings outside where people can walk a labyrinth. We have a labyrinth in the ground, so people are walking on the earth. Some of these locations in San Francisco and New York City have labyrinths that are outdoors that patients and visitors can walk, because there's just something very meditative about how to do that. In a larger context, I think that there are ways of advocating for sites like that in one's own community. of finding some of the local areas that were sacred to the indigenous people and acknowledging them in some way, finding out a little more about, what existed in the places that we live now that were inhabited by people who lived in right relationship with these places for thousands of years. It hasn't taken us but a few hundred to kind of, see what's happened to our environment. Like we're just, as a culture, we're not in right relationship with nature. And until there's a little more awareness about that, we're going to continue facing some of these dramatic changes. Whether we can shift them is a big question. But regardless what the future holds for us, we're all alive now, and we all still have the opportunity to acknowledge that there's something we as a culture haven't seen very clearly, and that there are mentors and allies and so many different ways that we can find access. It's almost like finding the inroad that's right for the individual. For some people, it could be, working with geometry, learning about some of these simple practices of being present when you're in nature, to just also honor, because, Delilah, there's so much divisiveness going on. I'm partly listening to myself and trying to imagine somebody with a much more kind of fundamentalist approach than I personally have, listening to these words and, realizing, okay, that's gonna create reaction, right? And
Yes.
I both kind of like that. I try to listen with that, and I also want to believe that humans are capable of a little more respect and tolerance than what we're seeing right now, and the reactivity that's normalizing violence is one of the more dramatic, harmful, and just I don't quite know what the right voice is for that. Other than just, can we all trust that for the most part, most human beings do care, but they've been forced by either violence that's been perpetrated against them as where they are in the political spectrum, or about their religious preferences, or, and it's hard to not be reactive, when that happens to your family or your school or your political candidates. So we're in such a challenging time, but I believe in the power of the human heart. I really do believe that reconnecting through love and respect and tolerance is going to be the only way through, and not to be in make wrong and blaming. We're never going to find the healing balm if that's the filter we're looking through.
Yeah, I think you're completely correct about that. It's I'm getting is the answer really is connecting to nature and connecting to community. Being out of sometimes we're so deeply embedded and completely in the chaos or in the there's a lot of static there, a lot of dissonance, and coming back to nature and coming back to community together is a way to connect back to that essence and that frequency that can help us to contribute and can help us to sort of alleviate some of this chaotic energy, right? Because it's we're functioning in a practically it's all based on frequency. And so I feel that places that, like, for example, your place, that has this connection to nature and to community is a very important resource, and not necessarily just that one. It could be, for anybody listening out there, you could go up in the mountains and have a picnic with your family and just feel what comes back with you, right? A different frequency that you can bring back into your community, instead of, being super under the water with all this chaos that is going on. And then from there, acting from a place where you can bring that back into your community and make some changes. And, if you feel that your calling and your mission is to really make an impact on the ground, or at a different rule-making process, or at a different energetic level process, whatever that is, bring it. It's working on ourselves and then bringing that impact back into the earth. Because, like you're saying, we need to work together. We need to work together to make changes on the planet, because, in a sense, we are very much going in the wrong direction with all the stuff that is happening, right?
Totally. And, you're bringing up a couple of things that I think are essential. I think frequency is fundamental to having, some kind of awareness that frequencies have an impact. 5G has an impact. It's been, there's enough measurable data about that a lot of people are developing environmental reactions to those frequencies. And I was just at a presentation the other night that was saying, so it's not about fighting against it as much as learning how to harmonize with it. And this particular program was talking about some of the geometric fields that can be generated that actually harmonize that frequency. And that, to me, is really partly what ultimately sacred activism could aim towards. How do we create a harmonization, given there's, in this country, from really the beginning of the country, it started really with the Civil War, that the fact that there was such a split, in values, and, I don't actually see that ever becoming one thing. But to be a harmonic of a dynamic nature rather than, opposing factors feels absolutely essential. Can we find a way of realizing, red and blue does make purple? Purple's a higher frequency. It would be everybody's advantage if we could create that. And I think the other thing, and talk about going out in nature, I think there's a real call for some deeper sense of silence and coming to a quiet place, both physically, moments of silence, developing an inner silence and a place of deeper calm that doesn't always have to respond through reactivity when we're challenged by the many things that exist to give us the opportunity to practice. Can we come back to considered and creative response rather than a bombastic one? And so just back to frequency for a minute. So there's something about music and octaves and expansion that certainly what we're seeing from James Webb photography of, the expanding universe and how many galaxies are out there, and just the vastness of where we live and how we actually have a possibility to be connected to all that, not even just our families and communities, but something so vast as the miracle of life and light and the organized principles of how the planets move around the sun. It's an orchestration of geometry and music. And to see some of that and to realize we're not only in a field of chaos, but we're in a field of pattern that moves according to, like I've been looking at some of the patterns that the planets create, that Mercury, creates a pattern that's based on threefold. When you look at it over a period of time, Venus is fivefold. Over 8 years, it creates, from Earth's point of view, a pattern of a five-pointed star. And each planet has a geometry that it draws in the heavens from our perspective. And when I really started thinking about that, it's like chaos does not rule that. That's an intelligence that's based on proportion and beauty and, unfolding pattern that's exquisite. So there is a frequency that's, that everyone has access to without ever violating somebody's religious or spiritual beliefs. It's like, it's not at that level. To me, that level is one that we get to choose, and either it comes through a family lineage or from, waking up experiences that we have, whatever. But we often develop communities that agree on those things. So there's some sense of, we belong somewhere. Yeah. And, what if we actually realize that we belong to a universal intelligence that loves that we're so unique, that loves, like in a vast garden, walking through the Denver Botanic Gardens and just witnessing that each flower, each plant produces something so unique and medicinal, many of them, and that each of us can be that and truly be ourselves without having to condemn the other. And I mean, that's a big ask in a world that's willing to, fight for their beliefs, to kill for their beliefs. That's something that, seems a little bit out of the question at this point in time, but I personally don't feel it can ever totally be out of the question, because that's our origin. I mean, we're all sourced from something so extraordinary. The fact that each human being exists is nothing less than a miracle.
I love that. That's so beautiful. We all have our constant authenticity. How you were mentioning the flowers and all the different things, that you realize that everything has its authenticity, its rhythm, its unique existence. And when you were talking about the planets, I'm thinking, well, if this planet started to do the other threefold rhythm, then it would be out of rhythm, right? It cannot be itself. And it just brings back to a reminder to live in that constant authenticity, to be who you are and your unique self, and live in that consistently so that you can do what you came to do here on planet Earth. And in that functionality, you're at your highest frequency, right? Because authenticity is a very high frequency. Then you can contribute at a very high frequency in that kind of way.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And to find that the expression of that frequency is not a denial, the idea that comes through some of the integral work is that we transcend and include, all the things that we've learned. We don't ever have to deny them totally, but we kind of have to keep in motion, because the minute we get stuck in belief systems that keep us rigid and angry and fighting, it's a little hard to get out of those boxes. And they don't have to be completely denied, but to keep moving. To me, that's what true evolution is. It's a response to, higher and higher frequencies of that authentic self. And an acknowledgement of what makes this planet so exciting is that diversity. So the diversity of a field of wildflowers, or just the different environmental and ecological layouts of, even in the state of Colorado alone, there are so many, environmental and ecological expressions, and none of them are right. All of them are right. None of them are wrong. It's just like the diversity. I live up in an area that pretty much is surrounded by a monoculture forest. And when I find myself in, I just drive 10 minutes away and suddenly I'm surrounded by trees that I don't see out my window. and that, it just sort of reminds me that, I love this environment, and the diversity that happens with more deciduous trees is a very different experience. Or being in the desert, and suddenly coming across either an oasis, or, driving into Western Colorado to come to a place like Paonia, or some of the places where peaches grow in, the high climates of the state. It's like the planet has such rich expressions. It's not a wonder that humans have so much diversity. So wouldn't it be something if we could celebrate that and not only identify with the groups that think like us, but to create a little more of the dynamic dance of, whoa, what happens? When we create an amazing meal, it's because we found ways that foods and spices work together to create something much more than that one ingredient by itself would be.
Yeah, to respect the different ingredients. That's key. It's respect, right? To allow room for that, allow room for you, allow room for the next person to be themselves, and not wanting to force to be like me. You have to think like me. You have to do what I'm doing, right? Have that diversity. That's beautiful. I was talking about frequency. It brings me back to, you talk so much about the Sophia lineage, and it's a unique frequency. Why at this time of planetary shift, why is that so important? Why is the feminine so important at this time?
Really? Why?
Let's dive into that.
I can only speak from my biography. I think for me it was part of the whole background lineage. I remember being 5 years old in a Sunday school setting, and sitting there kind of just genuinely asking the question, why do we say "ah men" and not "ah women"? And that wasn't well received. But I remember the moment. I don't have a lot of those memories, but that memory is really clear to me. And as I grew and matured into my teenage years, I had a wonderful. She would have been sort of a second cousin, a cousin to my father, who was a Catholic nun. My family was not Catholic because there were two brothers, and one converted from Catholicism, and that was my grandfather. So we had Irish Catholic nun at all our family reunions. And I was so moved by her. She was extremely bright. She was everything that you would want, in your family tree, as a representation of a woman who was intelligent, heartfelt, and had a remarkable life of service. So early on, I kind of had that presencing, and as I kind of came into being an older teenager, I found that I was really curious about where was the feminine presence in Christianity. And because of a kind of Catholic leaning, I could see her in Mother Mary. And I also knew enough as a sort of rebellious teenager to know that, being a mother only was not the role that represented all women. Not all women were going to be mothers, and if they weren't, then they weren't respected. That didn't feel so great. Mm. So for me, it became like it was a defining aspect of what drew me forward, was where were the women teachers in the kind of explosion that I experienced when I first came to Boulder in 1969, and was working very closely with some of the opening of other spiritual paths through a project called the Holy Man Jam, which brought together some of the luminaries of the early 70s into Boulder. But as one of the organizers of that event, I'm sitting in the audience going, wow, I've got 8 men up on stage. This was at the UMC in the university, and it's like, where are the women? So that question took me, into my own pursuit. And as I've, again, that was, 55 years ago, some of that. And I'm not in the same level of pursuing, but I'm still asking the question. It's like, for me, I'll just use a little metaphor. So David and I decided, as part of the sacred activism of our pursuit, that the universe or our destinies delivered to us this opportunity to work in the Middle East in the early 2000s. And we went back and forth to Israel and Palestine for quite a few years. I'm going to say 8 or 9 trips. Mm-hmm. To find what was the commonality of women, Israeli Jewish women, Israeli Palestinians, Palestinians who were not part of Israel, who were in Gaza or the West Bank, and finding and Christian women and pagan women, and just bringing women together to ask this question, like, could we as women, and David was sort of our, token male, because a lot of particularly the Arab women, weren't going to be allowed to come to any kind of gathering if the men didn't meet a man who was going to kind of keep an eye on them. And he had amazing experiences encountering both Jewish and Arab men who checked him out and kind of, like, did he have what it was going to take to, make sure that, as best as he could, that these women were safe. I mean, that whole situation is personally such a heartbreak to me right now, because we just really felt like there was a window of opportunity where there was more, not just our program, but many programs that were advocating for, how to help build something. But one of the phrases that came out of that experience for me was that, the Middle East, and particularly that part of the Middle East, was often considered the cradle of civilization without a mother. And that metaphor became so poignant to all of us, to all the women who, many of them found their way to get beyond, some of them had lived through 6 or 7 wars, that all lost husbands, brothers, children, fathers, in these wars. And finally, and we went back into the mythology of Abraham and Sarah and Hagar, and how, trying to come to grips with why was there so much, divisiveness and unsettling. And, it's only truly been so exacerbated, it's just even hard to imagine how it will ever resolve. Like, just so much in the last 3 years of, the horrors of war and how much suffering. So I feel like, the feminine principle, let's take it out of gender, male and female, man and woman. The feminine principles to me are about nature, nurturing, relationship, community, caring for the world, caring for the parts of the world that are unseen, caring for humanity, caring for, earth, air, fire, water as living elements. So to me, that is all Sophia. I've spent quite a bit of time finding, you mentioned in the intro, the Sophia creation myth is something that kind of comes out of some of the early Gnostic texts. The Gnostics weren't Christian. They were alive before Christianity and after Christianity, and they were, not, some of them began to identify as Gnostic Christian, but Gnostics kind of had their own lane of direct experience and direct knowing way back, in that era. And some of those texts that came through Nag Hammadi, many of them mention Sophia. And the Pistis Sophia was one of the texts that found its way earlier than the Nag Hammadi texts. And it's a fascinating document. And in it, there comes this voice of Mary Magdalene that didn't appear in the synoptic texts of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in the New Testament. So that was partly what started to feed this flowering of, so maybe Mary Magdalene wasn't what Pope Gregory said she was in 613 AD, when he said she was the same as the woman who was stoned for adultery. So some of this emerging, I think, is bigger than just personal pursuit. So speaking for me personally, those things started to happen, though David and I had a fair amount to do with the translation into English of the Gospel of Mary that Jean Leloup wrote, and that is one of the better translations of the Gospel of Mary, was one of the Nag Hammadi texts, and was also found in two other places, in Oxyrhynchus and I think the Berlin Codex. So this gospel sort of has now become, started to come into the light. It was part of what Dan Brown used as some of his research. And in the mid-90s, we were in the south of France kind of pursuing what was more a direct experience of Magdalene before there was much to read about that, which happened in a dream when we were in Israel. So it, kind of pieces together that there was this cultural awakening happening and a very personal one that balanced each other for me. And Magdalene, going back to the Catholic side of my bloodline, I found that Mary had more to say to me as a woman, a modern 21st century woman. I've since come and certainly have a deep, deep love for Mother Mary and for really all the principles of the feminine, from Lakshmi to, indigenous representations of the corn goddess, or, however she shows up. But my personal allegiance has been more and more guided by this emergence of Magdalene in the culture. And because I feel the relationship that she had with Yeshua, without taking a stand, did they have children and all of that, that to me wasn't as essential as the fact that they had a relationship that does appear in the Gnostic text as one of profound respect. She was an extremely intelligent woman. She was not a whore. And at the same time, she also offered, through the church's representing of her as the penitent Magdalene, she offered a lot of hope and perspective to women who were forced or chose that lifestyle. So for me, it's not like there's a right way of even who she was and but it was discovering a guide and a mentor that, I now have a really deep connection to, and I can read things about her. Some things I agree with, some things I don't, but it doesn't impact my personal relationship. That's what's alive. You use the word authentic. That's what's authentically been a guiding principle for the unfolding, and it created for David and me a kind of mentoring between Yeshua Magdalene as more accessible humans to pattern a relationship after, and then way out there was sort of the Christos Sophia impact and influence of what I consider to be the creative forces of all life, the light. And, the Sophia as wisdom. And it appears actually the way she appears even in the Bible, in Proverbs and Psalms, Sophia as wisdom. She existed before there was light. And that, those kinds of things are fascinating to me. It's like, and certainly when you read some of the Upanishads, there's, this essence that creation happens between two, right? There is source, and the source is a unified whole, but the minute there's creation, there's two. There's source and there's creation, and I feel that our biology mimics that. Like we create children when there's two.
And the cell duplicating itself, right?
Yeah. So it's not a denial of there's only one, there is only one. And the minute there's more than one, it starts with two. So she's been an influence, I think, for my whole pursuit of what's sacred and feminine principle, again, coming down to what's so needed in the healing of what's happening right now. In all the elements, in all the human expression, it's like, could we remember, our love of the mother with a capital M? We were all birthed, by a woman and impregnated by the father, and we need to kind of find that balance in ourselves.
I'm glad you touched on balance. Why is it important to have that feminine, masculine come into balance? And how can someone that's listening notice that they're out of balance in their lives?
Well, I think, again, there's probably 8 billion responses to that. Like, we all kind of know it, right? We all can feel when things are I would call it the flow, when we're in a flow mode, and there's just sort of a sense that, for me, the metaphor would be, I kind of feel like I have a hand on my back. I used to walk the bush in Australia a lot, and I had this agreement with some of the snakes, of which there were quite a few, that I care about snakes, don't want to kill you, and I really don't want to step on you. And so I had this agreement that if I'm about to step on a snake, would something let me know? And the number of times my foot hovered and my attention had wandered and I looked down, I was about to step on a coiled snake, was rather high. I never did step on one, and I always felt like something, was like, I had an agreement, right? Like, so something, whether it was presence of snake or, a guardian angel, I don't need to give it a name, but.
Lila, I love you. You know how much I love Australia. Like, it just makes me happy that you have that connection, and it's just amazing.
Yeah, it was a great chapter of our life, spending time in Tasmania. So how does someone know they're out of balance? I think that, sometimes that's the feedback loop of, something showing me that I am out of balance. I did some work early in the early 90s that basically the hypothesis was the world reflects me. My experiences in the world do reflect me on some level. And if I'm in a flow, there's a harmony. If I'm constantly, I went through a period in the 80s where I seemed to get more traffic tickets than was actually statistically likely. And, you know, it was with a point system at the time, and I was within a few points of kind of losing my license. And it's like, well, that's not going to work for me. So, so I had to wake up to like, I was not in balance. And I made a really, really conscious decision to actually slow down, because I like driving fast. So to slow down, to be much, much more aware and not in such a hurry. And, I never did lose my license, and I haven't had a traffic ticket in a very, very long time. So little things like that.
I think we both were a race car driver in our past lives.
I have no question about that. I've often said that, I have a passion for driving, so I've taken it to go-karts, and things like that, and try not to, endanger myself or other people with that particular identity. So I think that, we have feedback loops, and, when we're out of balance, we either feel it. I think it depends where people's strengths are. Like some people feel it physically, some emotionally, some mentally with agitation or anxiety or, but for me, it's like, what does life, because we've all probably also had moments of feeling in the flow, and we know what that is. When I feel out of flow, I really try to find the right inroad. Sometimes it'll be to fast or simplify my diet or get more exercise. Sometimes it'll be to have more time in silence and meditation, or more time in nature, just sitting on the earth. There's different ways we can enter our system to create more harmony. And that's up to us to wake up and know how to do that. And there's certainly out there are so many practices and teachings and teachers and opportunities for us, particularly living in Boulder, to find, the allies that we need to help restore that balance. And I think that's a really, really important accountability individually.
That's awesome. That's amazing. It's such a blessing, for you to be here with us today. Thank you so much, Lila. It's so much wisdom that you carry. I'm grateful that you are willing and able to share all of that wisdom from all of those experiences and lifetimes, not just this lifetime and the journey that has taken you, but beyond this, all of the wisdom that you've carried throughout all your lifetimes, and for you to share it so openly and willingly, with an open heart. And and your vision for today, to share with humanity and how we can do better. Do better, because we can certainly do better from where we are. So this conversation is a reminder that healing and balance and sacred activism, they begin with each of us. Each of us can do our part, right? And then come together and make a bigger impact and extend outwardly into our communities and the world we are helping to create, to co-create, to shape, right? So just with that being said, I'm super thankful and grateful for those listening out there. I encourage that you explore Lila's work and her place, her sacred space at the StarHouse.org, and to begin creating your own sacred space wherever you are in the world, whether at home or in nature. She had a beautiful example of how you can do that, and as a daily act of remembrance and connection. We need connection, more and more connection. So if you enjoyed this episode, with the Catalyst Show, amplifying voices, igniting change. Please subscribe and follow us at the Catalyst Show on Instagram and on Facebook. And together we keep amplifying voices and creating change in the world. Until next time, I'm Delilah Georgette, and thank you for tuning in. Thank you, Lila, for
Thank you,
being here with
Delilah.
us.
Take
Thank
care,
you so
everyone.
much.
Lovely to spend time with you.